The wind raged across the endless prairie, kicking up dust and ash from the smoldering remains of the wagon train. The acrid scent of burned wood and gunpowder hung thick in the air, mixing with the iron tang of blood. Anna Whitaker lay motionless beneath the splintered frame of an overturned wagon, her body pressed into the cold damp earth. Her heart pounded so hard she feared the warriors would hear it over the distant crackling of dying flames. She had seen death before, a mother lost to fever, a father claimed by rivers rage, but nothing had prepared her for this. Her people, the ones who had promised safety in numbers, had abandoned her. The screams of women and children had rung out in the night, but she had not screamed, not when the men ran, not when her neighbor took one last desperate shot before vanishing into the shadows, leaving her behind. She swallowed against the DR, in her throat, blood warm and sticky trickled from a gash at her temple, soaking into the collar of her dress. The world swayed around her, shapes shifting in the dim moonlight. She forced herself to focus. She had to stay awake. If she fell unconscious, she would not wake up again. Distant voices carried on the wind, low murmurs punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. The warriors were still here, scavenging what little remained. She strained to make out their words, but their tongue was foreign. The sound sharp and unfamiliar. A boot scuffed against the dirt not far from her hiding place. She clenched her jaw, willing herself to be still. A shadow passed over her. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, then silence. She dared a slow breath, but movement beyond. The wagon caught her. A man stood at the edge of the firelight, his gaze fixed on the ruins of the settlement. Even from a distance, she could see the way he carried himself, straight back, broad shouldered, his face unreadable beneath streaks of war paint. His eyes swept the destruction, scanning the wreckage with the patience of a hunter. Anna remained frozen, her lungs burning from the effort. If she moved, if she even breathed too loudly, he would see her. The moment stretched thin. With a sharp whistle, the warriors gathered their horses. They had what they came for. As their voices faded into the night, and closed her eyes and listened to the sound of hoof beats retreating across the plains. She waited long after they were gone, until her limbs ached and her fingers had gone numb from gripping the dirt. When she was certain she was alone, she crawled from her hiding place, her muscles trembling beneath her. Her body felt foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. The wagon train was no more. The supplies were gone, the horses stolen. The firelight flickered over the corpses left behind, their faces unrecognizable in the dim glow. She turned away quickly while rising in her throat. She was alone. A sob built in her chest, but she swallowed it down. She could cry later. Now she had to move. She forced her legs forward, stumbling toward what had once been the supply cart. A few charred scraps of cloth were all that remained. The canteens had been taken. The food store was raided. The only thing left was a broken knife, half buried in the dirt. She grabbed at the prairie, stretched in all directions, endless and empty beneath a sky freckled with stars. She had no map, no compass, no sense of where to go, but standing still meant death. She turned toward the horizon, picked a direction, and walked hours. Past the night air grew colder, seeping through her torn dress and into her bones. Her boots dragged through the tall grass, each step heavier than the last. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. She pushed forward, her limbs burnt, her lungs ached the wound at her temple throbbed with each beat of her heart. The prairie was merciless, stretching endlessly with no shelter, no water, no sign of life. By the time she reached the river, the first traces of dawn were bleeding across the horizon. The water shimmered in the pale light, a slow-moving current that promised relief. She collapsed at the bank, dipping her hands into the cool depths. She drank greedily, barely pausing for breath. The cold slid down her throat, and for the first time since the attack, something inside her loosened. A branch snapped Behind her, Anna froze, her pulse pounded. In her ears, as she turned her head, a man stood at the tree line, watching her not. Just any man, him, the warrior from the fur light. He was closer now, his presence unmistakable against the morning haze. His face was still streaked with war paint, his long hair tied back from his face. His expression was unreadable, but his stance was deliberate, as if he had expected to find her here. Panic surged through her. She scrambled back, but her limbs were weak, her body too drained to obey her commands. The warrior took a step forward. She gripped the broken knife tighter, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. His gaze flickered to the weapon, then back to her for a moment. Neither of them moved. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Anna stared after him, her chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Her hands trembled around the knife. She wanted to believe it was exhaustion, but deep down she knew the truth. She was afraid, more afraid than she had ever been. The sun continued at slow ascent, bathing the land in a golden glow. She should have felt relief, but the unease lingered in her bones. He had found her. Once he would find her again, and next time she might not be so lucky. The Cheyenne camp loomed ahead, a gathering of hide-covered lodges standing like sentinels against the vastness of the plains. Smoke curled from distant fires, the scent of roasting meat thick in the air, but Anna barely noticed. Her wrist burned with the leather bindings dug into her skin, her body weak from exhaustion and thirst. The warriors had forced her to walk for hours, tethered like an animal behind their horses. Every step had been a battle, but she refused to let them see her falter. She kept her chin high, though fear noted at her ribs. The warriors had said little since capturing her, only exchanging knowing glances, yet the weight of their decision pressed down upon her. She was not guest, she was a prisoner, and prisoners rarely lived long. As they entered the village, children ran to see the newcomer, their wide eyes filled with curiosity and something darker expectation. The women watched from their work, some whispering behind their hands, others glaring openly. She understood without needing words. She did not belong. They dragged her toward the largest lodge, where an older man stood, waiting, his arms folded over his chest. His face bore the lines of a life spent making hard decisions, his gaze sharp as flint. The chief, his eyes swept over her, assessing me. She is worthless, one of the warriors said, nudging her roughly forward. A settler girl, nothing more. The chief remains silent, his expression unreadable. The moment stretched thick with unspoken judgment. Kill her, another voice suggested. Cast UAL as discussing the weather. She means nothing, and is pulse pounded. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from trembling. Let her run. The words came from the warrior who had found her at the river, the same one who had spared her. His voice was calm, yet there was something behind it, something unreadable. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Some nodded, entertained by the suggestion. Others frowned. The chief studied Anna, then the warrior who had spoken. His gaze lingered before he gave the smallest nod. Let her run, he agreed. The warriors led her away from the camp center, taking her to a clearing just beyond the village. There they cut her bindings and shoved her forward. Anna staggered, but remained upright, her breath sharp in her throat. You run, one of them said, grinning. If you reach the river before we catch you, you live. The others chuckled, the sound carrying no warmth. And if I don't, she asked her voice hoarse. The man smiled wider, tapping the blade at his waist. Anna swallowed. Run. She turned and bolted. The world narrowed to movement and breath, the pounding of her feet against the ground, the sharp intake of air into her lungs. Tall grass whipped against her legs. Roots threatened to trip her, but she forced herself forward. She had no choice. Behind her, the sound of horses. They were toying with her. She could hear their laughter, their ants. They could have caught her already if they wanted to. They were playing a game, and she was the prize. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She pushed harder, her body screaming in protest. The river Wasn't far if she could just an arrow. Fed into the dirt beside her breath. Hitched another one landed inches from. Her foot panic surged like wildfire. They were closing and she reached the tree. Line diving into the cover of the forest. The shad swallowed her, the air thick, with the scent of pine and damp earth. She went through the trees, ducking beneath. Branches stumbling over roots the horses could not follow here. She had a chance. Her lungs burned every muscle in her. Body begged for rest, but she could not afford to stop. Not yet. A shadow moved. Ahead she skidded to a halt, her breath. Ragged strong hawk, he stood between her and the river, his dark eyes unreadable. He had no weapon drawn, no sign of aggression. He was simply there, and his chest rose and fell, sweat dripping down her spine. Behind her, the laughter of the other warriors grew fainter. They had let her slip into the trees, lost interest in their sport, but he had not. They stared at one another, the silence heavy. She gripped the knife they had left her with, the dull blade offering little comfort. His gaze flicked to it, then back to her. He sighed. Go, he said, voice quiet. She didn't move. Run, he repeated. She hesitated only a moment before she did. The river was ahead. She could hear it, smell the damp air. Her legs carried her forward through the trees toward salvation. She reached the bank and collapsed on her knees, her hands plunging into the cold water. She gasped, her lungs drinking in the crisp morning air. She was alive. She had won, but she knew the truth. They had let her win, and that terrified her more than anything. The river had saved her life, but had not saved her from the wilderness. The water had given her a moment of reprieve, a sense of victory over the men who had hunted her, but survival was a career game. In a had run, but to where there was no settlement, no familiar road leading back to the world she had once known. She had nothing but the tattered clothes on her back and the dull knife clutched in her aching fingers. The cold gnawed at her skin, her limbs weak from hunger and exhaustion. Every step she took through the thick underbrush felt like a battle. She was slowly losing by the second. Night, she could no longer force herself to keep walking. She built a crude shelter beneath the twisted roots of a fallen tree, pressing herself into the earth in a desperate attempt to hold on to warmth. Her body trembled violently, and her thoughts drifted in and out of coherence. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled, their eerie voices merging with the wind. She was dying. Her breath came in slow, uneven gasps, her fingers too numb to curl in a fist. She closed her eyes, accepting the quiet pull of sleep. Then a noise, soft footsteps on frost-hardened ground. Anna forced her heavy lids to open, her vision blurring. At the edges, a figure stood in the darkness just beyond the dying embers of the fire she had barely managed to start. A man. She knew who it was before he stepped forward. Strong hawk, he crouched beside her, studying her with unreadable eyes. In the dim light, she could see the sharp angles of his face, the set of his mouth. He said nothing. She tried to push herself upright, but her body refused her. Fingers barely twitched against the frozen earth. She hated the vulnerability of it, the weakness that left her utterly at his mercy. Leave me, she whispered, though she had no strength to make a command. He didn't. Instead, he reached inside his blanket and pulled out a strip of dried meat, holding it out to her. Anna's pride screamed at her to refuse, but hunger was stronger. With the last of her strength, she took it. The next time she opened her eyes, morning light filtered through the trees afresh. Fire crackled nearby, its warmth sinking into her stiff limbs. She was still beneath the fallen tree, but a heavy buffalo hide now covered her pulse. Quickened, she turned her head. Strong hawks at a few feet away, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate movements. He did not look at her, as if waiting to see what she would do. She pushed herself up, her body weak, but no longer failing her. The warmth from the fire seeped in her bones, but she did not feel safe. She could not understand why he had stayed. She could not understand why she was still alive. Why are you here? She rasped. He did not pause in his work. He would not have lived another night as simple. Truth, no mockery, no amusement she had. Nothing to offer in return for his kindness, nothing but a way heart and a desperate need to survive. I don't need your help, she said, though even she did not believe it. He finally lifted his gaze, dark eyes steady on hers. Yes, you do. Days passed, and Anna did not die. She should have run the moment she was strong enough, but where would she go? The prairie stretched in every direction, endless and merciless. She had no food, no water, no way to make alone, and so she stayed. At first, she kept her distance, but Strong Hawk did not press her with questions, nor did he act as if she was a burden. He went about his business, hunting, checking traps, preparing food. Occasionally he left without a word and returned just the same. He never asked her to follow. He never told her to leave. The silence between them became something she could almost understand. She began to watch him more closely. The way he moved, the way he listened. He was a man of purpose, each motion precise and deliberate. He had been one of the men who hunted her, but he had also been the one to let her go. One evening, as the fire crackled between them, she dared to ask, you defied your people when you let me go. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, you had done nothing to deserve death. She frowned. That didn't seem to matter to the others. His jaw tightened. It mattered to me. She did not know what to say to that. The days turned to weeks. The snow melted from the ground, the bitter winds turning to crisp spring air. Anna learned. Strong Hawk never offered to teach her, but he did not stop her from watching, from copying. She learned how to set traps, how to clean a rabbit, how to ride a horse with more confidence than she ever had before. She was not a guest, nor was she a prisoner. She did not know where she was. One afternoon, a group of trappers stumbled upon their camp. Anna saw the greed in their eyes before they even spoke. Alone woman, a Cheyenne warrior. She had seen men like them before. One of them grinned, his teeth stained yellow. Didn't expect to see his settler girl way out here. Strong Hawk did not move. She is not yours. The trapper chuckled. That's so. Maybe she'd like to decide that for herself. Anna did not hesitate. She grabbed the knife at her side, the same dull blade she had carried since the hunt, and met the man's gaze. Already half the fight was brief and brutal. Strong Hawk moved like a storm, swift and unstoppable. Anna had never seen a man fight like that before. He fought with no hesitation, no mercy. She did not stand aside, waiting to be saved. She lunged at one of the trappers, her knife sinking into flesh. The man fell. The others ran. When it was over, the silence stretched long and thin between them. She was breathing hard, her hands slick with blood. Strong Hawk watched her, unreadable as always. You were not the same woman who ran from the village. No, she was not. That night, as the firelight flickered, she did not sit apart from him. She sat close. The change between them was not spoken of, but it was there, lingering in the way he handed her a piece of meat before she asked. In a way, she trusted his presence beside her when she slept. One evening, as she combed her fingers through her tangled hair, she felt his gaze on her. She met a question, unspoken, a challenge perhaps. She did not look away, and neither did he. The morning air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the forest alive with the soft sounds of waking creatures. Anna stirred beneath the buffalo hide, her body attuned now to the rhythm of the wilderness. She no longer woke with the sharp-edged panic that had been her constant companion in the beginning. Survival was no longer something to happen to her. It was something she had learned to claim. Strong Hawk sat by the fire, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate movements. He had been watching the trees, listening to the world beyond their camp, as he always did. There was something different in the way he held himself, something that set her instincts on edge. She sat up, pushing sleep from her limbs. What is it? He did not answer. Right away, the knife glided along the stone in a steady rhythm. Before he finally said, they are coming. A chill settled in her bones. Despite the warmth of the fire, she knew what he meant to Cheyenne, his people. They had found them. She had known this moment would come, known it from the day He had defied them to let her go from. The day he had made his choice, but knowing did not make the reality any easier to face. How many, she asked, already reaching for the bow he had given her. She had never been a fighter, but she had learned she had bled enough. She met his gaze across the fire. You could go back, say you made a mistake. His expression did not change. Would you? She knew her answer before he even asked. She had come too far, lost too much. She would not go back to the girl who had once been left for dead. That girl was gone. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Then we make our stand. Strong Hawk nodded. There was no hesitation in his movements, no fear in his gaze. They moved quickly, packing what they could, leaving behind what would only slow them down. They could not outrun the war party. They would have to face them. Anna felt the weight of a bow in her hands, the pull of a knife at her waist. She had killed before she would do it again. The first sound of approaching riders reached them. Just as they reached the river's edge, Strong Hawk turned, scanning the trees. They will try to talk first, he murmured. She set her jaw, and if talking fails, his eyes darkened. Then we fight. They came in silence, their horses moving like shadows. Through the trees, warriors in war paint. There their faces unreadable, their bows drawn, but not yet loose. At the center of them sat Red Bear. Anna knew him even before Strong Hawk whispered his name. There was something in the way he sat, his horse, the way he held himself. A man who had once called Strong Hawk brother. Red Bear's gaze swept over them, lingering on her before shifting to Strong Hawk. You should have returned. His voice was even, but the threat beneath it was clear. Strong Hawk did not flinch. I did not belong. Red Bear's jaw tightened. You chose an enemy over your own people. And a step forward before she could stop herself. I was never your enemy. Red Bear's gaze flicked to her, unreadable. And yet our brothers are dead because of your people. My people left me for dead, she said, voice steady. I have no claim to them anymore. The warriors stirred at her words, but Red Bear remained unmoved. This cannot be, he said at last. Strong, you know the law. Strong Hawk's fingers flexed at his side, but he did not reach for his weapon. The law is wrong. A murmur rippled through the warriors. Red Bear's eyes narrowed. You would spill our blood for her. Strong Hawk did not hesitate. If I must. The silence that followed was thick as the air before storm. Anna felt the tension coil in her chest, ready to snap. Red Bear exhaled slowly. Then so be it. The world exploded into motion. The first arrow whistled past Anna's ear, embedding itself in the tree behind her. She loosed her own without thinking, her arms moving before her mind could catch up. A warrior felt the fight was chaos, a blur of movement and sound. Strong Hawk moved like a force of nature, his blade finding its mark with deadly precision. Anna stayed closer, arrows quick and sure. She did not think of mercy, she thought only of survival. Red Air came for Strong Hawk, his blade flashing in the fire. Light they met with a clash of steel, and fury. Brothers turned enemies. Anna barely had time to react before another warrior launched for her. She twisted the knife in her hands, meeting flesh. Warm blood splattered her skin. The warrior fell. She turned, breath ragged, searching for Strong Hawk. He and Red Bear circled each other, both bloodied, both unwilling to yield. Red Bear struck first, his blade slicing across Strong Hawk's side. Anna moved before she knew what she was doing. She raised her bow. Red Bear saw her for a brief second time, slowed. She loosed the arrow. It struck true. Red Bear staggered, his eyes widening as he looked down at the shaft buried deep in his chest. He fell to his knees. Strong Hawk stood over him, breathing hard. Red Bear's lips parted, but no words came, only the sound of the wind through the trees. The other warriors hesitated, then slowly they lowered their weapons. Anna's heart hammered in her chest. Red Bear had been their leader. Without him, they had no command. Strong Hawk stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the remaining warriors. Leave they did. Anna watched as they melted into the forest, their shadows swallowed by the night. It was over. She turned to Strong Hawk, reaching for him as he swayed on his feet. Blood soaked his side, but he caught her hand, Holding it tightly, his gaze searched. "Hers, you saved me," he murmured. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. "We save each other," he exhaled, his grip tightening. "What now?" She looked toward the horizon, the sky painted with the first hints of dawn. "We go forward," and together they did. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and wood smoke as Takwachi stood at the edge of his village, his breath shallow, his mind warring against itself. The moon cast long, silvered shadows over the Shawnee encampment, where warriors sharpened their blades and whispered of bloodshed to come. A raid had been planned. By dawn, they would descend upon the settlers who had dared to carve homes into land that was not theirs. But Takwachi would not be with them. He turned his gaze toward the darkened forest beyond the village, where the woman and her 2 children lay sleeping in a house that barely held together against the restless prairie winds. Margaret Whitmore. Her name had become an ache in his chest, something foreign yet familiar. He had sworn to hate her kind, had been raised on stories of white men's treachery, of families torn apart, of fathers never returning home from battle. But Margaret was different. She was alone, and worse, she had been abandoned by her own people, left to survive or perish at the mercy of the land. His brother's voice cut through the night like a blade. "You will fight with us." Takwachi did not turn. He did not have to. He knew Chaska's stance, the weight of his anger. "I will not." A long silence. Then, the dull crunch of footfalls in the dirt as Chaska moved closer. "You shame our father's memory." At that, Takwachi turned, eyes narrowing in the moonlight. "Our father died because he believed that war was the only answer." Chaska's lips curled into a sneer. "And you think love is?" Takwachi exhaled sharply, his fingers curling into fists. "I think there is another way." Chaska's gaze flickered with something. Pity, perhaps, or contempt. "She will not save you. She cannot. And when the elders learn of this, they will not show mercy." The words should have frightened him. Perhaps they did, deep in the part of him that still clung to the traditions of his people. But Takwachi had already made his choice. He had made it the moment he had first seen Margaret kneeling by the river, scrubbing the blood from her husband's coat long after he had been buried. She had known then that she was alone. And so had he. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the trees. The night swallowed him whole. Margaret lay awake in the small, creaking cabin, her body curled around the warmth of her sleeping children. The wind rattled the loose planks, whispering through the cracks like unseen fingers. She had known this place would never be home. The land was too wild, the nights too long, the dangers too many. But she had no other choice. She had come here with her husband, fleeing war and hunger, believing that the frontier would offer them something better. It had given her a grave to dig instead. A rustling outside made her stiffen. Her fingers found the rifle propped against the wall. She moved quietly, careful not to wake the children, and crept toward the door. She knew the Shawnee sometimes came near. She had seen them in the distance, shadows moving through the trees, watching, but they had never attacked. Not yet. She drew in a slow breath and unlatched the door, stepping onto the porch. At first, she saw nothing, just the endless stretch of prairie and the dark hulk of the woods beyond. The moon was high, its light revealing every whisper of movement in the grass. Then a shape emerged from the trees. She raised the rifle. Takwachi lifted his hands, his stance neither aggressive nor fearful. "You are in danger." Margaret didn't lower the weapon. "I always am. They come at dawn," he said simply. "You must leave." Her heart pounded against her ribs. She had suspected this day would come, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way she wasn't prepared for. She tightened her grip. "Why are you telling me this?" Takwachi hesitated. He could have given her many answers. Because she had once saved him. Because he could not watch her children die. Because he had spent too many nights thinking of her when he should have been dreaming of war. Instead, he said, "Because I have no wish to see you harmed." Margaret studied him. She had never feared him, not in the way she feared other men. He had come before, never asking for anything, never taking. Just watching, just waiting. For what? She did not know. She lowered the rifle. "You can help me?" Takwachi gave the smallest nod. Margaret exhaled, glancing toward the door. The children. I will carry them if I must. A pause. Then she nodded, disappearing inside. She worked quickly, bundling what little they had into a worn leather satchel. The children stirred, confused but obedient. Her daughter, barely 8, clung to her arm. Mama, we have to go, Margaret whispered. Now. The girl blinked, sleep-heavy eyes. Where? Margaret hesitated. Then, simply away. The boy, only 5, clutched a small wooden horse, one of the last things his father had carved before he died. Margaret swallowed hard. Takachi waited by the door. When she emerged, he did not speak. He only gestured to the woods. They slipped into the darkness, the children half asleep in their mother's arms, the world behind them fading like a bad dream. They moved swiftly through the trees, guided by Takachi's sure steps. The wind had picked up, sending the branches creaking overhead. Margaret's breath came fast, her boots sinking into the damp earth. Where are we going? She whispered. Takachi didn't look back. Far enough. Her grip tightened around her son's small frame. She didn't know where far enough was, but she had no choice except to trust him. A sound in the distance made her heart stop. Hoofbeats. Takachi tensed, his hand darting to the knife at his waist. Margaret's stomach clenched. They're coming. Takachi pulled her into the shadow of an ancient oak, pressing a finger to his lips. Move when I say. The hoofbeats grew louder, the riders swift, determined. Margaret pressed the children close, feeling their small bodies tremble against her. Takachi listened. Then, quietly, we go now. They ran. The forest blurred past them, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Branches clawed at Margaret's dress, snagging, slowing her down. The children whimpered, but did not cry. Behind them, the hoofbeats changed, slowing, searching. Takachi veered sharply to the right, leading them deeper where the trees were denser. He crouched beside a fallen log, motioning for Margaret to follow. She knelt beside him, cradling the children, their breaths ragged in the silence. The riders passed. One lingered. Margaret felt her pulse hammer against her ribs as a figure on horseback paused just feet away. She could hear the creak of leather, the quiet snore of the horse. Then the rider turned. The hoofbeats faded. They waited until the night swallowed them whole once more. Takachi stood, scanning the darkness. We keep moving. Margaret exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She didn't know where this road would lead, but she knew there was no turning back. The sky had begun its slow descent into dawn, a murky gray swallowing the last remnants of night. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the chill biting at Margaret's exposed hands as she tightened her grip on her children. They had been moving for hours, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her limbs, but there was no stopping. Not now, not with death riding on their heels. Takachi led the way, his movements quick, calculated. He listened more than he spoke, his eyes darting to the shifting shadows between the trees. Margaret didn't ask where they were going. She had learned by now that questions meant little out here. You moved, or you died. That was all. Her daughter whimpered, clutching at her mother's skirts. Mama, I'm tired. Margaret swallowed, running a hand through the girl's tangle of dark curls. I know, love, she whispered. Just a little longer. Takachi stopped suddenly, his hand raised. Margaret froze, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then she heard it, a distant rustling, the snap of a branch beneath a careless foot, the sound of something or someone moving through the underbrush. Takachi's jaw tensed. They're close. Margaret pulled her son tighter against her chest. What do we do? He glanced at the trees, scanning, considering. Then he motioned toward the river, its dark waters glistening through the breaks in the branches. We cross. Margaret's breath hitched. The river was wide, its current swift, churning against the rocks like an unbroken beast. She shook her head. The children. There is no other way, Takachi said. They will not stop. Margaret turned, searching the darkness for their pursuers. The hoofbeats had not yet returned, but she knew they would. Her throat tightened. Takachi knelt beside the little girl. Can you hold on to me? She hesitated, her small fingers curling into her mother's skirt. "It's all right, love," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Go with him." The girl nodded slowly, letting Takachi lift her into his arms. Margaret hoisted her son higher onto her hip and stepped forward. The river loomed ahead, cold and unforgiving. Takachi waded in first. The girl whimpered at the sudden chill, burying her face against his shoulder. The water rose swiftly, biting at his waist, then his chest. Margaret followed, gasping as the cold wrapped around her legs like iron. Each step was a battle against the current, her skirts dragging, threatening to pull her under. Then came the sound she had dreaded. Hoofbeats. She turned, breath shuddering. A single rider had broken through the trees, his silhouette stark against the bleeding dawn. He didn't call out, didn't hesitate. He simply raised his rifle. Margaret didn't think. She turned and plunged forward, the water swallowing her whole. She fought against the weight of it, kicking, gasping, her arms tightening around her son as they tumbled into the current. Somewhere beside her, Takachi moved steadily forward, his grip firm around the girl. Then shot. The bullet struck the water with a dull thud. Another followed, whizzing just past Margaret's ear. She forced herself forward, her limbs screaming, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The river pulled at them, dragged them downstream. Margaret felt her son slip, his tiny hands clawing at her dress. She gritted her teeth, hauling him back up, ignoring the burn in her muscles, the crushing weight of the current. And then, suddenly, the bottom. Her boots scraped against the riverbed. She lurched forward, coughing, sputtering, clawing her way onto the opposite bank. The moment her feet hit solid ground, she collapsed, clutching her children to her chest. Takachi was beside her, the girl still clinging to his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. Margaret turned, chest heaving. The rider had not followed. He remained on the far bank, rifle still raised, watching them. Takachi exhaled. They will not cross. Margaret swallowed against the lump in her throat. What? He glanced at the water, then back at the rider. They believe the river is sacred. Margaret let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. They had been saved by something older than bullets, older than war itself. But she knew this wasn't over. She forced herself to her feet. We need to keep moving. Takachi nodded. Without another word, they disappeared into the trees. The trading post was little more than a ramshackle collection of wooden buildings, huddled against the prairie like a dying thing. The smell of sweat and tobacco clung to the air, mingling with the sour stench of unwashed bodies. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, pressing the children closer as she stepped onto the dirt road. Takachi walked ahead, his shoulders tense, his eyes scanning the crowd. He was a stranger here, an enemy in the eyes of most. But he did not waver. Margaret caught his arm. "Are you sure this is safe?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, "Nowhere is safe." She didn't argue. Inside the post, the air was thick with smoke. Men leaned over barrels, trading stories and coin. A woman in a stained dress slumped against the bar, laughing too loudly at something she didn't find funny. Margaret stepped forward. "We need supplies." The trader behind the counter barely looked up. "Silver or goods?" Margaret reached into her satchel, pulling out the last of her husband's coins. She set them on the counter, her fingers trembling. "Food. Blankets." She hesitated, then, "A horse if you have one." The trader swept up the coins with a practiced hand, squinting at them in the dim light. Then, he turned, gathering what she had asked for. Margaret exhaled, glancing at Takachi. But he was no longer looking at her. His body had gone rigid, his gaze locked on a figure in the corner. A man. He was watching them, a slow, knowing grin creeping across his face. Margaret's stomach dropped. The man rose, tipping his hat. "Well now," he drawled. "Ain't this a sight?" Takachi's hand moved to the knife at his belt. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that look. She had seen it before. The look of a man who saw something he wanted, or something he could sell. "Now, don't go getting all jumpy," the man said, stepping forward. "I just reckon a fellow like that," he nodded toward Takachi, "might be worth something to the right folks." Margaret's breath came fast, her fingers tightening around her son's wrist. The man grinned. "Tell you what, I won't make a fuss. Just hand him over nice and easy, and I'll even let you keep the horse." Margaret's pulse roared in her ears. Takachi didn't move, didn't speak. Then in a flash, his knife was in his hand. Margaret barely had time to cry out before the room erupted. The man lunged. Takachi met him halfway, the blade flashing in the dim light. A shout rang out, followed by the crash of splintering wood as they slammed into a table. Margaret grabbed the children, shoving them behind her as the room exploded into chaos. A gunshot cracked the air. Men scrambled, overturning chairs, shouting. Takachi moved like a shadow, swift and deadly. He twisted, knocking the man's arm aside, sending the pistol skidding across the floor. Then, without hesitation, he drove the knife forward. The man choked, his eyes wide, his mouth opening in a soundless gasp. Then he crumpled. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then someone shouted, "Murder!" Margaret's stomach lurched. Takachi turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Run." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the children and ran. The night swallowed them whole once more. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and fear. Margaret's breath came fast and shallow as she urged the children forward, her fingers wrapped so tightly around their hands that her knuckles ached. Behind them, the town was coming alive with alarm. Shouts rang out, booted feet pounded against the dirt, and somewhere a whistle blew, sharp and urgent. Takachi was already ahead, his body low as he guided them through the tangled alleyways behind the trading post. His presence was a steadying force, but Margaret knew even he could not outrun the consequences of what had happened. Killing a man in a place like this had a way of settling over town like a sickness. It wouldn't be long before the law, or something worse, came for them. Margaret's chest tightened with panic. "Where do we go?" Takachi didn't hesitate. "The foothills. If we make it past the ridge, they won't follow." She swallowed hard and nodded. There was no other choice. They ran. The prairie opened before them, an endless stretch of darkness beneath a sky cut with stars. The land was merciless, its beauty edged with danger. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries weaving into the night's tension. Margaret forced herself to keep moving, her skirts tangling around her legs as exhaustion gnawed at her bones. The children stumbled beside her, but they did not complain. Even they understood the weight of what hunted them. Then hoofbeats, a dozen at least, thundering from the town, drawing closer. The riders were moving fast, the glow of torches cutting jagged streaks through the darkness. Margaret felt her heart slam against her ribs. They would never outrun horses. Takachi turned suddenly. Into the ravine. Margaret hesitated. The land dropped sharply ahead, a gash in the earth filled with twisted trees and jagged rock. It was no place for children, but there was no time to argue. Takachi lifted the little girl into his arms. "Trust me." Margaret gritted her teeth and followed. The descent was brutal. Loose soil crumbled beneath their feet, sending them sliding down the steep embankment. Branches clawed at their clothing. Stones sliced at Margaret's hands as she caught herself from falling. The boy clung to her, his breath hot against her neck. Somewhere above, the riders pulled up short. Angry voices barked orders, but they did not immediately follow. Margaret pressed herself against the rocky outcrop, listening as the voices tangled together in debate. "They're down there. It's too steep. We'll lose the horses. Then we go on foot." Margaret turned to Takachi, her chest heaving. He met her gaze and gave a single decisive nod. They had minutes at best. The ravine was a labyrinth of shadows and treacherous ground, but Takachi moved as if he had known this place his whole life. He led them along a winding path, his grip steady on the child in his arms. The trees thickened, and with them came the scent of water, damp earth, moss, the crisp bite of an unseen stream. Margaret prayed it was enough to cover their trail. Then a voice cut through the night. "Takachi!" They froze. Margaret turned, her blood running cold. A lone figure stood at the edge of the ravine, his rifle aimed straight at them. The torchlight behind him flickered, casting jagged shadows across his face. He was Shawnee, one of their own, but there was no mercy in his expression, only the weight of betrayal. "You would die for this woman?" the man spat. "For a white woman who does not belong to us." Takachi did not flinch. "She is not theirs either." The man sneered. "You were once a warrior of our people. Now you are nothing." Margaret's heart pounded. She knew what this was. This was not just a pursuit of vengeance for the man Takachi had killed. This was deeper. This was retribution for a choice Takachi had made long before tonight. A choice that had marked him as an outsider to his own kind. The rifle cocked. The children whimpered. Margaret stepped forward before she could think better of it. "Please," she said, her voice raw. "We mean no harm." The man barely spared her a glance. His focus remained on Takachi, his grip tightening around the trigger. Takachi spoke then, his voice low and firm. "Do not do this." The moment stretched, brittle and thin. The distant riders were still coming, their approach marked by the rhythmic thud of hooves. There was no time. Then, suddenly, a new sound split the air, the unmistakable crack of a branch behind them. Margaret barely had time to react before another figure emerged from the trees, moving fast and low. A knife flashed in the dim light. The Shawnee warrior turned just in time to meet his attacker, but he was too slow. The blade found its mark, sinking deep into his ribs. A sharp gasp escaped his lips. His rifle tumbled from his hands. His body sagged forward. The stranger caught him as he fell, lowering him gently to the ground. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The man who had come to their aid was older, his face lined with years of hardship. His hair was streaked with silver, his stance weathered but strong. His eyes found Takachi's, and something unspoken passed between them. Takachi knelt beside the fallen warrior, pressing a hand to his chest. Blood bubbled from his lips, his breath shallow. "Brother," Takachi whispered. The man coughed, his body trembling. "You have chosen your path." Takachi's expression did not change. "I have." A flicker of something passed through the dying man's eyes. Perhaps regret, perhaps understanding. Then, with one final breath, he was gone. The older man straightened, his gaze sweeping to Margaret and the children. "You must go." Margaret hesitated. "Who are you?" Takachi rose, wiping the blood from his hands. "An old friend." The man nodded. "I will delay the others. But this is your last chance. You must disappear." Takachi turned to Margaret. "Can you run?" Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but she nodded. And so they ran. The night swallowed them whole, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. The land stretched before them, wide and merciless, but with the promise of freedom beyond the next ridge. And somewhere, beneath the weight of all they had lost, there was hope. The wind carried a biting chill as Clara Bennett pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The night was too quiet. No voices murmured in the nearby wagons, no rustling of movement from the other settlers. Only the hollow whisper of wind through the brittle grass. A knot of unease twisted in her stomach. She pushed herself up from the cold ground, her hands stiff and aching from the evening's labor. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a feeble orange glow on the worn leather boots of the men who had, hours earlier, gathered around it. Now, there were only footprints in the dirt. Her heart slammed against her ribs as her gaze darted toward the wagons. Empty. No lantern light, no shifting canvas, no distant mutterings. She staggered forward, half expecting to hear Samuel's voice, her husband's voice, telling her it was all in her head. But Samuel was gone, 3 weeks in the ground after a skirmish with raiders, and the men who had sworn to take care of her had made their decision. She ran to where their supplies had been stacked. Gone. The water barrels, the food, even her meager bag of belongings. Only a tattered wool blanket remained, draped over a broken wagon wheel like an afterthought. Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. They had left her. They had left her to die. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a rock, sending her sprawling into the dirt. The taste of earth filled her mouth, but the sting of betrayal burned hotter. These men, Joseph Miller, the supposed leader, and the others who had once called her family, had spoken in hushed tones over the past few nights, their glances lingering too long in her direction. She should have known. She should have run. But where? The plains stretched for miles, the nearest town days away by wagon. On foot, alone, with no supplies, she wouldn't last the week. The weight of it settled on her chest. This was a death sentence. The cold pressed against her skin as she lay there, staring up at the vast, indifferent sky. The stars had never seemed so distant. She refused to die here. Clara pushed herself upright, shaking the dust from her skirts. Her mind raced. Water. She needed water. The nearest river was half a day's journey east, but without a horse, without food, she would never make it. A flicker of movement in the trees. She froze. Not all dangers on the frontier came from men with wagons. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her as she slowly reached for the knife strapped to her thigh. One of the few things Samuel had made her carry, insisting she always be armed. The sound came again, closer this time. A rustle, a breath, the snap of a twig. Clara turned, heart hammering, as a shadow emerged from the trees. The man was tall, lean, dressed in worn buckskins that clung to his powerful frame. A rifle was slung across his back, and a bow hung loosely from his hand. His face was sharp, angular, his dark eyes locked onto hers with unsettling intensity. A Navajo! Her fingers tightened around the hilt of her knife. Stories flooded her mind, stories told around the fire, whispered warnings from the settlers about the dangers lurking beyond the frontier. Savages, they had called them. Killers. Raiders. But the man before her did not move to strike. He studied her for a long moment before shifting his gaze toward the abandoned campsite. Then he spoke, his voice a low, measured rumble. They left you. It wasn't a question. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand her ground. What do you want? The man did not answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze flicking down to the knife she still held in a white-knuckled grip. She should run. She should fight. But where would she go? And how long would she last? The stranger gestured toward the darkened plains behind him. Come. Clara hesitated. She should refuse. Shouldn't she? But there was no logic in refusing when death was the only alternative. Her mouth was dry as she nodded, once, and stepped forward. Clara stirred at the scent of wood smoke, her body aching from exhaustion. Her limbs were stiff, heavy, as though they had been pressed into the earth overnight. The last thing she remembered was following the stranger through the darkness, her feet bleeding, her throat raw from thirst. Now warmth cocooned her. Her eyes fluttered open to dim morning light filtering through a small dwelling. The walls were made of packed earth and timber, the ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. A fire crackled in the center of the room, a thin stream of smoke curling through a hole in the roof. She tried to sit up, but a deep ache spread through her ribs. Her breath hitched. Someone had wrapped her in blankets, thick woolen ones that smelled of pine and smoke. It took her a moment to remember she was still alive. She had followed the man through the night, too numb to protest, too desperate to refuse. Now he stood at the other side of the fire, crouched as he turned a strip of meat over the flames. His presence was quiet but commanding. He had removed the rifle from his back, setting it against the wall, but his bow still lay within reach. His dark eyes flicked to her as he spoke, his voice steady, low. Eat. The word was simple, yet it carried weight. It was not a suggestion. Clara hesitated. She had heard whispers of Navajo ways before, had listened to stories told in fearful tones about their warriors. Some claimed they took captives. Some claimed they were merciless. But he had not harmed her. Slowly, she reached for the strip of meat he offered. It was warm, tough, but rich with flavor. The moment it touched her tongue, she realized how starving she was. She ate too quickly, nearly choking on the first bite. The man sat back on his heels, watching her. You have a name? He asked. His English was rough, but clear enough. She swallowed hard. Clara. He gave a single nod. Tohi. A silence settled between them. The fire crackled, filling the space where words failed. She didn't know what to say. He had saved her, but why? What did he expect in return? She tightened her grip on the blanket around her shoulders. Why did you help me? She asked finally. Toei's gaze didn't waver. You were dying? She frowned, waiting for more, but he said nothing. You don't know me, she said. A slight tilt of his head. I know they left you. The words struck deep. She looked away, pressing her lips together. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she wasn't some helpless woman in need of rescue. But wasn't she? Hadn't she been left to die, like a sick animal unfit to keep up with the herd? She forced herself to sit up, ignoring the way her ribs protested. I can't stay here, she muttered. I have to find my way to a town. Toei didn't move. You leave now, you die. His voice carried no threat, only fact. She bristled, but deep down, she knew he was right. The plains stretched endlessly beyond these walls, the nearest settlement days away. She had no horse, no food, no weapons aside from her knife. Toei stood and grabbed a bundle of supplies. He tossed a water skin toward her. Drink. She caught it awkwardly, lifting it to her lips. Cool water slid down her throat, soothing the dryness that had been gnawing at her since the night before. She drank deeply, savoring the relief. When she lowered the water skin, he was watching her again, studying her with a quiet intensity. You learn, he said simply. She frowned. Learn what? To survive. Something in his tone sent a shiver through her. This was not a question. This was a decision already made. She hesitated, but what choice did she have? The first lesson came at dawn. Toei led her outside, the crisp morning air biting at her exposed skin. His home, if that's what it was, stood nestled against a rocky outcrop hidden from the open plains. A thin line of smoke still trailed from the chimney hole. Beyond it, the land stretched out, golden and endless. He placed a bough in her hands. Clara stared at it. It was lighter than she expected, the smooth wood polished by years of use. She turned it over, tracing her fingers along the carved designs etched into its length. Toei stepped behind her. Draw. She hesitated, then lifted the bough awkwardly. The string was taut, resistant. She pulled, her arms trembling from the effort. The bough barely moved. Toei exhaled through his nose. Again, her muscles burned as she tried again, this time managing to draw the string an inch farther before her grip failed. You are weak, he said. She clenched her jaw, her pride stinging. I wasn't always, she muttered. Toei studied her for a long moment. Then remember. She met his gaze. There was no cruelty in his words, only truth. And so she did. For the next few days, he taught her. The bough was only the beginning. He showed her how to track in the dirt, how to listen to the wind for signs of danger. He showed her how to move without sound, how to recognize the plants that could heal and the ones that could kill. She failed. Often, she fumbled the bowstring. She tripped over her own feet. She mistook poison sumac for wild berries and spent an entire afternoon curled in the dirt, cursing through the pain. But she did not stop, and neither did he. Toei never spoke in excess. His words were measured, deliberate. He did not waste time on praise or comfort. But she began to understand him in small ways. The way he tested her, pushed her, not out of cruelty, but necessity. One night, as they sat by the fire, he handed her a small knife. The handle was smooth, carved with patterns she did not recognize. She looked at him, puzzled. For you, he said simply. She ran her fingers over the blade, feeling the balance of it. Why? Toei stared into the fire. Because you're no longer dying. She swallowed, unsure of what to say. A silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. It was something else, something steady. Days passed, then weeks. Clara's hands grew steadier. Her steps grew surer. She learned to recognize the shift in the wind before a storm rolled in. She learned to string a bough with ease, to get a fish without flinching. She learned to listen, really listen, to the world around her. She did not forget the past. She did not forget what had been stolen from her. But she no longer feared the woman she was becoming. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she stood atop a rocky ridge, staring down at the open land below. Toei stood beside her, silent as ever. She turned to him. What now? He did not answer right away. Then, finally, he said, You are ready. She frowned. For what? His dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something there beyond the quiet strength. Whatever comes next, the words settled deep within her, heavy with unspoken meaning. She nodded, and together they walked into the unknown. The wind carried the scent of dust and blood. Clara crouched low against the ridge, her breath steady despite the pulse pounding in her ears. Below, nestled against a dry riverbed, the settlement sprawled like a wound upon the land. It had taken weeks of tracking, of careful, methodical pursuit, but finally they had found them. The men who had left her to die. Joseph Miller. The name sat heavy on her tongue. He was there, standing near the largest tent, flanked by the same men who had stolen her food, her horse, her future. He had not changed. The thick beard still shadowed his jaw. The slouch of his shoulders still spoke of arrogance. He was laughing, sharing a bottle with the others, as if the past weeks had meant nothing to him, as if he had not condemned her to a slow, agonizing death. A cold, steady rage settled in Clara's chest. Beside her, Tohi watched in silence. He had said little since they picked up the trail, but she had felt his presence like a constant tether, grounding her. He had given her time to decide, to wrestle with the ghosts of her past. Now, there was no more time. She glanced at him. "We go at sundown." A flicker of approval crossed his dark eyes. He did not ask if she was certain. He already knew. The hours dragged as they waited for nightfall. The sun sank, washing the land in bruised shades of red and gold. By the time darkness settled, Clara's grip on her bow was steady. They moved like shadows, slipping through the high grass, their steps silent against the dry earth. Tohi signaled to her, 2 fingers raised, then pointed toward the guard standing near the horses. She understood. He was hers. Clara inhaled deeply, then knocked an arrow. The familiar tension of the bowstring pressed against her fingers as she took aim. The arrow flew true. The guard crumpled without a sound, the shaft buried deep in his throat. Tohi was already moving. His knife flashed in the firelight as he took down the second man before he could even draw his weapon. The camp stirred. A murmured voice. Footsteps crunching in the dirt. Then, "Hey!" A shout. The moment shattered. Clara sprang forward as the camp erupted into chaos. Men stumbled from their tents, reaching for weapons, for rifles. The first shot rang out, shattering the night. She threw herself behind a wagon, the wood splintering as another bullet tore through it. Tohi was a blur of motion, his knife flashing, his bow bending and releasing in rapid succession. Clara drew another arrow, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she picked her target. She loosed it just as one of the men raised his pistol. He fell before he could fire. Then she saw him. Joseph. He was running, shoving one of the others aside as he made for his horse. "Coward!" Clara vaulted over the wagon, her boots kicking up dust as she pursued him. He fumbled with the saddle, cursing under his breath. She was on him before he could mount, grabbing his coat and wrenching him back. He stumbled, falling hard against the dirt. His eyes went wide as he looked up at her. "Clara." She pressed the tip of her arrow against his throat. "Didn't think you'd ever see me again, did you?" Her voice was calm. "Steady." Joseph swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he held them up in surrender. "Listen, whatever you think." "What I think," she repeated softly. "I think you left me to die." His mouth opened, but no words came. She saw the truth in his eyes. He had never expected her to survive. She could end it now. A single thrust, a single release of her fingers, and it would be over. But something held her back. She had survived, not because of revenge, not because of anger, because she had become something more. Slowly, she lowered the bow. Joseph exhaled in relief, then grunted as she drove her fist into his jaw. He crumpled to the dirt, unconscious. The camp lay in ruin behind her. The remaining men had either fled or fallen. Smoke curled from overturned fires, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Tohi approached, his expression unreadable. He looked down at Joseph, then at her. "You did not kill him." She met his gaze. "No." A long silence stretched between them. Then at last Tohi nodded. Together, they turned from the wreckage, stepping into the night, into the unknown. And Clara did not look back.